Nick, and thanks very much also to the Foundation for the invitation to write this paper on land reform for the common good. When I was given the brief to do that, I was asked to rather dauntingly summarise what had happened in terms of land reform policy since devolution, capture some of the essence of that, and also try to project forward a little bit to see where that might go next in terms of what politicians at least are fond of calling Scotland's land reform journey. So where we might go from here to integrating and implementing land reform that actually lives up to its promise of transforming land ownership and land use for the common good of Scotland's people. So I was delighted to accept that opportunity to do that. So what I want to do, hopefully you'll be relieved to hear this is not going to be death by PowerPoint. I just want to spend a few minutes really outlining some of the main points from the paper itself. Hopefully some of you, if not all of you, will have had a chance at least to glance through the paper. So I do just want to sort of set the context for what I'm sure will be.
Comments, I've got to decide quickly.
And somebody's coming through there. So I really just want to set the scene for the paper itself and for the discussion which we're going to have subsequently. And I want to start actually, as the paper does, with, given this is the Jimmy Reid Foundation, I want to start with Jimmy Reid's inaugural rectorial address at the University of Glasgow in 1972. Took place not 5 minutes walk from where I'm sitting speaking to you now. Most, if not all of you, will be very familiar with that address, the so-called rat race speech, seen as one of the greatest pieces of oratory of the 20th century, reproduced in full in the New York Times subsequent to its publication. Jimmy Reid took us as a theme for that particular address the topic of alienation, and he defined alienation, amongst other things, as the frustration of ordinary people excluded from the processes of decision making. He also talked about the concentration of power in fewer and fewer hands when he was talking about the economic system and the establishment's measurement of success in terms of the economic system as being solely profit. And he also talked as well about the need to move our wealth-producing resources and potential and make them subject to public control and social accountability. And he said, let us gear our society to social need, not personal greed. Now, I would say, and the paper indeed does say, that much of what Jimmy Reid had to say about power, economic and social justice, and the need to reassert the common good resonates very clearly with the long history of the Scottish land question, which goes back to the 18th and 19th centuries. And that question is essentially one of power, as Jimmy Reid himself alluded to. Who has power? In whose interests does it serve? And to what purposes? And so that's a fundamental motivating force, I would say, for the process and the policy context for land reform in Scotland. And it goes back to the 1880s and the radicalism of the Highland Land League when they campaigned for crofters' rights, which led to the Crofters Holdings Act of 1886. Go forward 30 years, and you see that radicalism as well from a UK government in terms of the Land Settlement Act of 1919, which enabled the resettlement or the settlement of particular areas, notably amongst others, North Talisker and the Isle of Skye, by purchasing land from private owners, or if necessary, being able to take possession of that land through compulsory purchase. So there's a lot of radical thinking and history in terms of the land question that certainly Jimmy Reid alluded to in his 1972 speech, and indeed alluded to and actually campaigned for throughout his life. And that's a huge part, of course, of his legacy. Now, in terms of that, as Mike mentioned earlier, that historically the land question and land reform has had a predominantly rural focus. It's also had a predominantly Highlands and Islands focus, of course, as well. And part of that does date back to the clearances. But when we think about contemporary land reform, it is as much an issue and a question for urban Scotland as it is for rural Scotland. And I want to kind of revisit some of that as we go through the paper as well, in terms of the issues. But I think that contemporary sense of communities' alienation from land's wealth, land's common wealth, as it should be, as it's extracted by unfettered market forces and distant decision-making processes far removed from people's everyday lives. I think that's something that Jimmy Reid would certainly well recognise. Now, the central contemporary political question over which Jimmy Reid's legacy as a lifelong campaigner for social justice casts a long shadow is what Scotland's government and parliament proposes to do about that. And my central argument in this paper is that contemporary land reform policy in Scotland is largely piecemeal and largely disjointed. It lacks both the necessary political vision and substance to deliver the systemically transformative social change implied by the political rhetoric that surrounds it and that has surrounded it since devolution. Part of that, again, Mike, you touched upon that in your introductory comments. When Donald Dewar, the late Donald Dewar, gave the John McEwen lecture in 1998, and I'm paraphrasing here, he said that he thought there was something important about the symbolism attached to land reform being amongst the first actions of the Scottish Parliament, and that he very much liked that. And I think that has been very, very important. And the symbolism of land reform, the totemic status that land reform has as a policy issue, does kind of indicate the imprint it has on Scotland's consciousness and conscious in that sense. But I think, having said that, Scotland and Scotland's land politics really urgently needs to rediscover and reassert its radical edge. And I think that's really, really important. So the paper is very much about exploring some of these issues. The first part of it, as I said, charts the course of land reform policy since devolution. And there's absolutely no doubt that there have been very significant and welcome developments in terms of policy in that period. And I certainly don't want to diminish what those are, because they are very significant and they are very important. So we've had, amongst many other things, 2 land reform acts in 2003 and 2016. And that has, and also a Community Empowerment Act in 2015. And that's introduced 4 community rights to buy, 3 of which do not require a willing seller. It has introduced asset transfer provisions to transfer more land in public authorities' ownership into community ownership or into lease arrangements. It has delivered a Scottish Land Fund, which has been integral in terms of supporting community purchases of land. It has an annual budget now of £10 million to help capital land purchases. The Scottish Government has made a commitment to increase that total to £20 million by the end of the current Parliament. Hugely significant in terms of that. And yet for all of that, all that's been achieved, successive governments since devolution's objective of substantially diversifying Scotland's uniquely concentrated pattern of rural land ownership in particular remains largely, almost totally unmet, frankly, in terms of its structural context. Look at the small amount of land, if you want to see the indicator, look at the small amount of land that is now in community ownership. In 2000, before any of that land reform legislation was enacted, there was 0.7% of Scotland's rural land in community ownership. In 2021, that figure's risen to 2.9%. Now, at best, that is a fairly modest increase in what is supposed to be a central component of Scotland's land reform policy agenda. And also, I'm speaking to you from Glasgow. I'm originally from the Isle of Harris in the Outer Hebrides. Most of the land that is in community ownership is in the Outer Hebrides. About 72% of that land is in the Outer Hebrides. So that's an outlier that masks the overall kind of picture in terms of that ownership picture. And if you look from 2016, and in terms of how much land the Scottish Land Fund, which is, as I said, is a very important instrument of policy, has delivered into community ownership, it helped to deliver into community ownership. That figure stands at 11,943 hectares. That's 0.1% of Scotland's rural land area. And 4 large-scale community buyouts take up 80% of that total of 11,943 hectares. In Garvalt, taking ownership of the West Helmsdale Crofting Estate, the Isle of Ulva, purchased by a Northwest Mill Community Company in 2018, and 2 purchases by the Langham Initiative of the Taras Valley estate there in the Borders. So to put those figures in perspective, that 0.1% of land being moved into community ownership since 2016. In 2022 alone, 139,124 hectares of Scotland's rural land changed hands, predominantly privately. And community land ownership or community landowners are absolutely conspicuous by their absence in terms of these transactions. And that in turn takes us to the next part of the paper, which outlines some of the issues associated, which I'm sure many people are familiar with here, with issues with what is essentially a dysfunctional and highly unregulated rural land market. And the Land Commission, the Scottish Land Commission, which is one of the most important, for my money, developments in the whole land reform policy process since devolution, created after the 2016 Land Reform Act. The Scottish Land Commission has done really valuable work over the last couple of years in actually giving us a sense of how that rural land market is working. They've published 2 reports in regard to that. And one of the things that these reports document is basically absolutely soaring values of a lot of rural land in Scotland. The average price of estates increased by 87% between 2020 and 2021, from an average of £4.7 million to £8.8 million. With the best will in the world, even with a Scottish Land Fund, that is putting land far out of the reach of ordinary people and ordinary communities across Scotland. Also, there are significant numbers of off-market sales. So a lot of these sales are actually happening without communities necessarily even knowing about them, which has a huge implication, I would suggest, about the transparency of that market. It's also characterized by what you might call, in terms of buyers in this kind of super rarefied market, it's also characterized by some who are what you might call super wealthy lifestyle purchasers. There was a famous quote, or quite famous quote, depending on what circles you kind of mix it, that was in the Scotsman from 2018, when a land market professional was talking about the market itself. And what they said was that for most buyers, an estate is a luxury purchase to enjoy, not unlike a super yacht or a Lamborghini. Now, I'm not sure necessarily that is the priority of communities that are looking to buy land. I think they're more interested in actually using it to sustain their populations, to retain and develop essential services, and to use assets for their collective benefit. It's a long way from that. But all of that then takes us to where we are now in relation to land reform policy and where it might go next. Now, as many, if not all of you will be aware, the Scottish Government is about to take the next step on this land reform journey in terms of its legislative aspects with a commitment to introduce a new land reform bill to Parliament by the end of 2023. That bill, as it stands, has an unambiguous rural focus. And arguably that should have an urban focus as well as a rural focus. And it has a focus as well on large-scale land holdings and reflecting some of the tensions and issues that I've just outlined in terms of the land market and other issues as well. And specifically, government is, I have to say, with broadly cross-party support, with perhaps an exception, looking to introduce a public interest test for large-scale land holdings and also other measures as well. So that's all very welcome, except there's a problem. The test has 3 criteria for what constitutes a large-scale land holding. One of them is a minimum threshold of 3,000 hectares. That threshold is far too high for the legislation to be meaningful in terms of the public interest test and all its associated measures. In fact, what it risks doing at 3,000 hectares is actually stymieing the policy intent of the legislation before it even gets out of the legislative starting blocks. And if whoever's on the line there wouldn't mind muting, that would be really helpful in terms of me keeping my train of thought. So it's really important to actually, for government and parliament, to actually think again about what that threshold should stand at in terms of a trigger. I've argued, as have others who submitted responses to the consultation on the bill, that the threshold should be much lower and that 500 hectares is a much more realistic threshold in that regard. And quite frankly, if you look at what constitutes a large-scale landholding throughout the European Union, for example, 500 hectares is a very, very large landholding. Certainly if you look at agricultural holdings in terms of their size. So government needs to think that through again, I would argue. And there's also merit for including what you might call a infrastructure of community significance as well. And that could be piers, harbours, community facilities, hotels, green space, etc., because that would enable the public interest test to be used within an urban context as well as a rural one. So again, there's something I think government should be thinking through there too. So the Land Reform Bill and its focus is welcome as long as it can actually be made fit for the purpose for which it is intended. And government, successive governments and parliament have long talked about the radical intent of land reform. You can go back over the public record in terms of motions, debates, and so on, and there's no shortage of MSPs and ministers who will say that they are determined to introduce radical land reform. The same thing is in the foreword to the consultation document on the current land reform bill. But we need to go much further. And public policy, this paper suggests, indeed argues, needs to be much more integrated in terms of what its land reform focus entails. So it needs to be more high profile, it needs to be more integrated, and it needs to cut across different government portfolios at national government level, and also in terms of its links between national government, local government, and communities themselves. That's really essential. And there is a template to enable that to happen. In 2014, the government-appointed Land Reform Review Group published its report, The Land of Scotland and the Common Good. It included 62 recommendations for what to do to modernise Scotland's system of land ownership and land use. Its headline key recommendation was that government should create a national land reform policy, a land policy for Scotland, and put together an integrated programme of land reform measures in order to take that national policy forward. That recommendation and many others remain unimplemented. It's time they were revisited in order to see the merit and assess the merit of implementing more of them in short, medium and longer term.
Say this is set to come down. That will be welcome news for the Chancellor, who's been pressing them
So in doing that, there are a number of recommendations that the Land Reform Review Group and others have actually put forward in terms of what kind of measures could be included in such a programme. And the paper goes over some of these very broadly in terms of it, and they're not new. They've all been said before, frankly, by the Land Reform Review Group and other campaigners, including folk like Andy Whiteman, the Revive Coalition, and many, many others. So none of this is news, frankly. And they include things like, for example, moving to more fiscal measures, including looking at the scope for introducing land value tax, looking at reform of succession law to end the distinction, as the Land Reform Review Group said, between movable and immovable property. A statutory limit potentially has been argued by some on the amount of land that can be owned by one individual or beneficial owner. Reform of the community right to buy legislation, governance, modernising the governance of the community common good land that exists, developing a community and implementing a community wealth fund to support land ownership and capacity building in that sense for communities. And there are many, many others. The key point, though, is that for that to happen, there needs to be the political will from government and from Parliament to make that happen, to make land reform a radical, genuinely progressive, integrated, cross-cutting policy proposition that will have an impact upon people's everyday lives in Scotland's rural communities and also in Scotland's urban communities. And so the paper calls very much for that in terms of doing so, and clearly outlines ways in which it could be done. The other thing that the paper calls for is for civil society to play its part as well in pushing for land justice and land reform that meets the objectives of land justice for the common good. And one of the ways potentially that could be done, I've suggested, is actually developing a convention, a Scottish convention for land justice, or some such mobilising, organising and campaigning mechanism in order to galvanise the support, the latent support and the real support, indeed the active support that actually exists in relation to that. I think that would chime very well with the historical legacy of land reform and the land question as an issue, and it would absolutely, I would suggest, chime very well with the legacy, the formidable legacy of Jimmy Reid as a long-standing, vociferous and articulate and deep thinking advocate of social justice. Thank you very much.